city of Lagos, there lived the mansion of a king called Olu. There was a darkness money could not chase away. He had everything a man could ever dream of, wealth that could buy silence, influence that could bend power, and a name that commanded respect in every corridor of high society. Yet, for all the glitz and admiration surrounding him, the one thing he wanted most continued to elude him: a child. His marriage to Queen Ode Alice was the talk of Nigeria when it happened. Their wedding was broadcast live, a royal celebration of modern love and legacy. People called them the power couple of Lagos. But 6 years later, their palace was quieter than ever, and behind every forced smile at public events, there was tension no camera could capture. King Olu had done everything humanly possible. He had flown to London for checkups, visited top fertility experts in South Africa, and even tried traditional remedies secretly to avoid the press. But every test on the Queen Ode Alice came back the same: she was perfectly fine. He tried to act calm and collected in front of her, brushing off the conversations whenever she brought up adoption or IVF. Deep down, however, a storm brewed within him. What if the whispers were true? What if he, the great King Olu, was the problem? That thought haunted him more than anything else. He began to notice the subtle ways people looked at him differently: his uncles teasing him about slow heirs, journalists asking harmless questions about succession, and even his friends making jokes that cut deeper than they realized. At night, when Queen Ode slept, Olu would stare at the ceiling, his mind consumed by questions no crown could answer. He had always been in control of his life, but now he was at the mercy of biology, of something unseen and humiliating. The pressure to continue the dynasty weighed heavily on him. His late father had built everything with his bare hands, and before dying, made him promise that the Ode name would never end with him. That promise now felt like a curse. Queen Ode Alice, on her part, had begun to lose patience. She loved her husband deeply, but she was tired of the empty nursery and the fake reassurances. Every time she smiled at family gatherings, she could feel the pity of other women who had children. Her mother-in-law, though polite in public, had already started making subtle comments about surrogacy and solutions. The palace was no longer peaceful. The king and queen fought more often, mostly in harsh tones behind closed doors, but sometimes loud enough for the maids to hear. It was during one of those lonely nights that Olu made a decision that would change everything. Sitting alone in his study with a glass of whiskey, he thought of all the tests, all the procedures, and all the fake encouragements. None had given him certainty. He wanted proof. He wanted to know the truth without anyone finding out. The idea seemed outrageous at first: a modern king secretly testing his fertility, but the more he thought about it, the more desperate he became. He couldn't trust hospitals anymore, leaks to the media were common. The only way to know for sure, he thought, was to test himself the old-fashioned way, with a woman who would never talk. He didn't have anyone in mind initially. His palace was full of staff, but he barely noticed them. However, one evening, as he was walking through the hallways, he saw one of the maids cleaning the floor near his office. Her name was Oma, a quiet girl from Abia who always kept to herself. She was hardworking, respectful, and unlike the other maids, she never tried to catch attention. For reasons he couldn't explain, he stopped to watch her for a moment. Something about her simplicity and calmness drew him in. That night, an idea began to form in his mind, and he hated himself for even considering it. But the voice in his head kept whispering that it was the only way. Days turned into weeks, and the tension between him and Ode grew worse. Publicly, they maintained their image, but privately, the marriage was cracking. Olu began noticing things differently: the empty crib room they had decorated 2 years ago, the unused baby clothes Ode refused to throw away, and the heavy silence that followed every doctor's appointment. He knew he had reached his breaking point. One night, he confided in his best friend, Chief Deo, during a late meeting at the yacht club. "What if I'm the problem, Deo?" he asked quietly, staring into his drink. Deo hesitated before answering. "You're not, my king. But if you truly want to know, there are ways. Just be careful what truth you're chasing. Some truths don't come back clean." Those words stayed with him long after the meeting ended. That night, as he returned home, the palace lights reflected on the marble floor, and everything felt too perfect, too fake. He walked past the queen's room, heard her soft sobs, and felt a pang of guilt. But his mind was already made up. He needed to know the truth for himself, not for the throne, not for the dynasty, but for his sanity. Inwardly, Oma had always believed that working in the Olu Oden's mansion was the greatest opportunity of her life. She had come to Lagos with nothing but a small bag, a few clothes, and the determination to support her widowed mother back in Abia. The palace was a world she never imagined being part of, marble floors that shone like mirrors, chandeliers that looked like stars trapped in glass, and people who spoke with a sense of importance. Yet, despite all the luxury surrounding her, Oma remained grounded. She never looked directly into the eyes of the king, never lingered when the queen spoke, and never gossiped like the other maids. She simply did her work, earned her pay, and sent most of it home every month. One evening, she was assigned to clean the king's study, a place most staff avoided because of how private it was. The king had been inside earlier, holding a tense call that ended with a glass shattering on the floor. When Oma entered the room later, the air still carried the weight of anger and silence. She moved quietly, sweeping up the shard and wiping down the desk. She didn't notice when the king returned. Olu stood by the door, watching her for a moment. There was something disarmingly calm about the way she moved, focused, graceful, unbothered by his presence. "Oma," he said, his deep voice startling her. She turned immediately, dropping her cleaning cloth and bowing slightly. "Your Majesty," she stammered. "You may continue," he said softly, his tone less commanding than usual. She nodded and continued cleaning, trying hard not to tremble. That night marked the beginning of a strange attention she could not explain. The king began noticing her more often, in the hallway, in the gardens, even in the dining area. Sometimes their eyes met briefly, and she would quickly look away, unsure if it was coincidence or something deeper. For Olu, however, the decision had already been made. He had watched her long enough to convince himself she was the perfect candidate for his secret test. She was quiet, discreet, and most importantly, innocent enough not to suspect anything beyond respect. Still, guilt gnawed at him each time the thought crossed his mind. He was a married man, a public figure, and a king with a reputation to protect. Yet desperation has a way of silencing conscience. In his mind, this wasn't about desire, it was about truth. Over the following weeks, he found subtle ways to draw closer to her without raising suspicion. He gave her new duties around his personal quarters, told his assistant she was trustworthy, and sometimes lingered to ask her questions about her life. At first, Oma was nervous. She couldn't understand why the king, of all people, would want to know where she came from or what her dreams were. But his kindness disarmed her. He wasn't cold or arrogant like she'd imagined. He listened when she spoke, even laughed once when she told him how Lagos buses almost made her faint her first week in the city. One night, during a heavy rainstorm, power went out across the palace. Oma was in the hallway with a lantern when she heard footsteps behind her. It was the king, soaked from stepping out of his car. She offered to help dry his coat, hesitant but sincere. In that small act of service, their worlds collided. One glance turned into a moment too long, and what started as a gesture of gratitude became something both of them would later regret. It was brief, confusing, and followed by silence. The next morning, Oma couldn't look at him. She begged to be reassigned to another part of the mansion, but her request was denied without explanation. Weeks passed, and she tried to bury the memory, convincing herself it had been a mistake she'd never repeat. But the whispers of fate have their own plans. 2 months later, she began feeling ill, nausea, dizziness, constant fatigue. At first, she thought it was malaria, but when the palace nurse examined her privately, the truth struck like lightning. She was pregnant. Oma's world collapsed in that instant. She didn't know what to do, who to tell, or how to survive it. Fear consumed her. If the palace found out, she could lose her job, or worse. But secrets have a way of slipping through cracks. A fellow maid noticed her throwing up one morning and whispered to another. Within days, rumors spread through the entire palace staff. By the time the queen heard of it, the whispers had turned into gossip too loud to ignore. Ade confronted her staff during breakfast, her voice trembling with rage as she demanded the truth. When she called Oma forward, the young maid broke down in tears, unable to speak. The queen's intuition told her everything before words could. That evening, the king came home to chaos. Ode was in tears, demanding answers. "Tell me it's not true, Olu. Tell me this girl's child isn't yours," she cried. The king said nothing. His silence spoke louder than denial. The palace guards and advisors watched in confusion as the once unshakable royal couple stood divided before their staff. The next morning, the media somehow got wind of the scandal. Headlines exploded across social platforms: "Modern king impregnates maid, royal palace in turmoil." The mansion that once represented power now felt like a cage. Oma was hidden away for her safety as reporters flooded the gates. The queen retreated to her mother's house, heartbroken and humiliated. And the king, though tormented by guilt, couldn't escape a strange mix of dread and relief. He had broken the one rule that kept his word intact, but soon, he would know whether his secret test had given him the truth he desperately sought. The day the DNA results arrived, the entire palace held its breath. The king sat in his private lounge, the document sealed in an envelope on the table before him. He stared at it for several minutes, his heart pounding louder than the ticking clock on the wall. He had waited for this moment for months, haunted by sleepless nights, whispers of scandal, and the heavy guilt that came with betraying his queen. When he finally tore the envelope open, his hands trembled. His eyes scanned the report once, then again, and for the first time in years, he exhaled deeply. The result was positive. The child growing in Oma's womb was his. He dropped the paper and leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. A strange mix of emotions washed over him: relief, shame, and confusion. He had proven what he needed to know: he was not infertile. But at what cost? Outside those walls, the world already knew of his affair. Social media was on fire with hashtags, memes, and debates. Some mocked him, others pitied the queen, while a few defended him as only human. It didn't matter. The damage was done. When the queen heard the results, she didn't speak for a long time. She just stood by the balcony of her suite, staring into the empty garden below. Her tears had dried, replaced by quiet fury. She loved her husband once, deeply, but now all she could see was betrayal. Yet beneath the anger, there was a painful truth she couldn't ignore: the child proved that the problem had never been him. It had been her. That realization crushed her spirit more than his unfaithfulness. When he finally came to see her, she couldn't even look him in the eye. "You got what you wanted, Your Majesty," she said bitterly. "Congratulations. You're a father." He tried to explain, but she walked past him, leaving him standing alone in the cold silence of the palace corridor. Word spread quickly beyond the palace walls. The press called it the royal scandal of the year. Paparazzi camped outside the gates, and every gossip blog in Lagos published speculative stories about Amara. Her name, once unknown, became infamous overnight. Some called her a homewrecker, others painted her as a victim. She couldn't go outside anymore. Even within the palace, staff members whispered and pointed when she walked by. She spent most days locked in her small room, crying quietly into her pillow, terrified of what her future would become. The king, however, couldn't bring himself to ignore her. Guilt had become a heavy companion. He visited her one evening when everyone else had gone to bed. She was sitting by the window, her hands on her growing belly, when he entered. The moment she saw him, she stood up nervously, unsure of what to say. He looked at her for a long moment before finally speaking. "I never meant for any of this to happen," he said softly. "You didn't deserve the pain my actions brought." She said nothing, just lowered her eyes. He continued, "You will not be thrown out, Oma. You will be protected, and this child will never be hidden or shamed." True to his word, he made arrangements for her safety and medical care. He bought her a small, private apartment away from the chaos, assigned guards to her, and ensured she lacked nothing. When the queen found out, she felt betrayed all over again. Her friends and relatives urged her to leave him, reminding her that public sympathy was already on her side. But she refused. "He may have lost himself, but he is still my husband," she said quietly during one interview. This palace will not be broken by gossip. Her strength surprised everyone, but her heart had grown cold toward him. Months later, Oma gave birth to a baby boy at a private hospital in Ikoyi. The news spread instantly, and once again, the media exploded. The king visited her in the hospital, holding the child for the first time. As he looked into the baby's tiny face, tears filled his eyes. This was the proof he had wanted so desperately, yet it didn't bring the peace he expected. Instead, it humbled him. He realized that while he had proven his manhood, he had also exposed the fragility of his soul. The royal household soon released a statement acknowledging the child, calling him an heir by blood though not by birthright. It was a diplomatic move that tried to calm the outrage, but it only fueled more discussion. Some praised the king for accepting responsibility, calling it a mark of integrity. Others condemned him for disrespecting his wife and humiliating the throne. Lagos became divided. Every talk show, social media influencer, and journalist had something to say about the king and his maid. Oma, meanwhile, chose silence. She avoided interviews, ignored money offers from tabloids, and focused entirely on her child. Her quiet dignity began to shift public opinion. Over time, people started to see her not as a scandal, but as a woman caught in a powerful man's weakness. The king himself withdrew from public appearances for months, focusing on charity work and palace reforms. Behind the scenes, he did everything he could to make peace with both women in his life. One evening, some months later, he addressed the controversy for the first time. Standing before an audience of dignitaries and journalists, he said calmly, "Leadership is not perfection. It is learning from the consequences of our own humanity. I have learned mine." The room fell silent. His words went viral the next day, and for the first time since the scandal began, people saw not a king above reproach, but a man capable of remorse. "Majesty," he said, "the boy carries your blood, your strength, and your name in spirit. Lagos has moved on. Let us move on too." The queen sat silently, her expression unreadable. Olu's hands tightened on the armrest of his chair. He knew this moment would come, but facing it was harder than he expected. After a long silence, he replied, "When the time is right, the truth will find its place." It was neither acceptance nor rejection, just a postponement of the inevitable. Later that night, the king stood on the balcony of his suite, watching the city lights spread beneath him like a sea of stars. The air was calm, but his mind wasn't. He thought about the choices he had made, the pain he had caused, the hearts he had broken, and the boy who now represented both his greatest mistake and his greatest blessing. He realized that fatherhood was not merely about proving ability, it was about taking responsibility, even when the world disapproved. When dawn came, Olu made a decision. He drove himself to Oma's apartment without his usual convoy. She was surprised to see him standing at her door, dressed simply in a white shirt and jeans. For the first time, there was no crown, no distance, just a man looking for peace. "I've spent years hiding what the world already knows," he said quietly. "It's time Somto knows his father, not as a secret, but as truth." Oma looked at him for a long time before stepping aside to let him in. Somto came running into the living room, smiling when he saw the king. Obinna knelt and opened his arms. The boy hesitated, then hugged him tightly. For the first time in a long while, Obinna felt whole. The truth had been painful, but it had also set him free. And as the morning sun filtered through the window, warming the small room, the modern king of Lagos realized that sometimes, redemption doesn't come through crowns or titles, it comes through love, honesty, and the courage to face the consequences of one's own heart. Thank you for watching. Let me know your thoughts. We encourage comments and discussion in the comments section. Guess what? Another story is coming up in a few days. Do well to hit the notification bell to be notified, and do subscribe and give a thumbs up to like and encourage this channel, Evelyn Sampson TV. Feel free to share and invite your friends. Thank you once again for being a part of our storytelling journey.